Well, I think that's a cue for us to start. Good evening, good afternoon, and morning to everyone, depending where you are joining us from, to today's interesting discussion on whether there would be an end to the Central Libya, Bank of Libya crisis. And to this distinguished panel that we have, I'll first outline briefly today's event, and then I'll be introducing the panelists, and we'll be asking 2 rounds of question, and then we open up for Q&A for everyone. There's also the possibility to pose your questions in the chat, and we will pick them up one by one. In August this year, the Libyan Presidency Council moved to replace Libya's longtime central bank governor, Sadiq al-Kbir, who held the position since September 2011. And in the period following this, the administrative division in Libya, he rose to prominent as an influential figure in this political scenes. In absence of functioning relationships between executive and legislative, the Central Bank of Libya took a lot of these competencies and became in junction with the Ministry of Finance and RBTA of Payments. In October, following a UN-led parallel back channels, a new governor was selected and the CBL board of directors reconstituted. So we will be discussing the challenges for this new leadership and the significant changes and what does that mean. But first, I'll introduce the panelists. Today we have with us Hafid Al-Ghawel, who's a senior fellow and executive director of the North Africa Initiative at SAS Foreign Policy Institute. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Center of Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. In previous roles as think tanks, policy institutions, and advisory bodies, Hafid is specialized in political economics of MENA region, government affairs, international relations, geopolitics, and geostrategic risks. He is also previously held senior roles in the World Bank and IMF and served as the Director of External Affairs and Communications and part of the senior management team at the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Governments. We also have Tim Eaton, who's a senior research fellow in the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. His research focuses on the political economy of conflict in MENA region and on that of the Libyan conflict in particular. Prior to joining Chatham House, he worked for BBC Media Action, BBC International Development Charity, and projects in Iraq, Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya. In Libya, Tim helped to set up and manage the BBC Media Action Bureau from 2013 and 2014. He is currently a PhD candidate in King's College London Department of War Studies. And of course, last but not least, we have Stephanie Williams, who is a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy, is also a senior fellow with SAS, and she held previously the position of the acting special representative of the Secretary General for Libya and head of the United Nations Support Mission in Libya, and before that as deputy special representative as well. Stephanie served in the US Foreign Service for over 24 years. Her research includes examining international mediation efforts in an era of global disorder and conflict resolution in failed states. Her career focuses on the Middle East region. And I failed to introduce myself briefly, but I'm Asma Khalifa, your moderator, as an associate fellow with Chatham House MENA program. Okay, so I'll pose the first question to Stephanie, actually. The CBL was a critical stakeholder during the time when you worked with the UN. How do you see the role it played, and to which extent the CBL has a power center in its own right? What lessons should the international community, in its own right? And I'll leave the space for you.
Great. Masa al khair, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Thank you so much, Asma. It's great to be on this session with my good friends Hafid Al-Ghawel and Tim Eaton. Thanks to Chatham House and the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute for putting this together. Well, before I answer your question directly, Asma, I would like to take this opportunity to say that I'm really glad that the CBL, the crisis has been resolved. And I would really like to commend the current UNSMIL leadership, acting Special Representative Stephanie Hori, and the whole team. It's good to see that there's a return to sort of muscular UN mediation. I think this is needed in these times, and it's reflective of sort of the philosophy that we applied, when I was at UNSMIL, which was we weren't just merely serving as messengers. We were actively engaged, trying to pick up the pieces of this fragmented country and put real solutions on the table. So yes, so our diagnosis, our understanding of the conflict really did put institutions like the central bank front and center. And why is that? This wasn't your classical sort of UN conflict resolution mediation setting, because Libya is a rentier state. So of course, the Central Bank of Libya, the National Oil Corporation, the Libyan Investment Authority, the Audit Authority, all of these institutions, it was very important that we have a direct relationship with them, which is why we sort of unusually in the classic UN mediation model, we established an economic policy unit in the mission, which reported to me directly. So that meant that we had experts in the mission who dealt directly, not going through various chains of command in the mission. They were able to deal directly with the stakeholders in these institutions, including the Central Bank of Libya. We also, I would just take your viewers back 6 years now to the late summer of 2018, when we had that attack on Tripoli. And there's a saying, why do people rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why were people attacking Tripoli in 2018 and 2019? It's because it's where the central bank is. So when we brokered the ceasefire for that minor war or smaller war, it did result in terrible casualties. There's nothing minor about that. When we did broker the ceasefire, we mainstreamed we put actually into the ceasefire agreement measures that needed to be taken with regard to the currency, closing the gap in the black market, and with regard to the other very necessary economic reforms. So we never took sort of your classical neoliberal, laissez-faire approach. We understood that this is a conflict where you have since 2011, it's a conflict over acquiring two of Gaddafi's, I think, greatest powers. One was his monopoly over the use of violence, and the second was his role as allocator in chief. Now, I think you can say to a great degree, Mr. Haftar, particularly in the areas that he controls, has that first quality, right? He has more monopoly over the use of violence. And until September of this year, the former bank governor, Sadiq al-Kabir, was essentially filled that role of allocator in chief. My judgment is whichever power, whichever individual can acquire those two assets of the former dictator will have a much better chance of, controlling the overall country. I'm not saying that's necessarily a positive trajectory with regard to, representative government, but that's sort of the analysis, and that was the philosophy that we took. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's very important to remember that he did fill up quite a lot of roles on both sides to try to continue his position. Hafid, how would you assess, in your view, the role and performance of CBL after 2011? And how did you see its role, if you did? How did you see that role change over the years? You're muted, Hafid.
This is becoming a tradition with me. I always mute myself. So, but thank you very much, and I'm really honored to be both friends, Ethan and Stephanie, and with you, Asma. The issue of the central bank, it started in 2012 when I first met Sadiq Lakbir in Japan at that time. It was the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF. And I saw the change that happened since then. But I think it's important to also understand that the background of this central bank is not a usual one. This is a central bank that had changed leadership instantaneously, has had to change the entire staffing of the central bank after the beginning of the civil war in Libya, which is still continuing. It's up and down, but it's still one continuous civil war that fragmented everybody. And the international community did not recognize it as such, and therefore it did not trigger what usually is triggered by a civil war, and demobilization, negotiation, reconciliation, all of these tools. But the central bank had to play a role much bigger, sometimes by choice, other times by necessity, much bigger than what central banks tend to do, or the traditional role of a central bank. You had, as Stephanie correctly pointed out, you have not just a normal central bank, but the distributor of the purse, of everything. There's nothing in Libya that does not depend on the oil revenues, including sports club or youth organization. And this is where the difficulty about Libya as a whole, not only economically, but also why Libya will probably, logically, at least traditionally, will never produce a democracy in the sense that we understand it. There are no institutions of any measure. Libya has, my description of Libya economically has always been as a, and I don't mean an offense by this, but I actually see it as a very pragmatic and practical description. It's a gas station. It's a gas station on the Mediterranean. Ships come by, fill petroleum or gas, and give the money to whoever is in control of that gas station. That person is the allocator, as Stephanie called them. They are the ones who fund everything. Now, this in itself makes it impossible for a country that every aspect of it is funded from the top down to actually build institutions from the bottom up to create some kind of a democratic participatory governance. That applies to everything in Libya, including the central bank. Central bank became the guys who are in charge of the cash that comes from the oil. Normally, under normal circumstances, that central bank is actually not in charge of any policy. Central bank basically manages the reserve of the country based on a budget that is passed as a law. That money should go to the administrative side of the government, usually the finance ministry, that allocates it in turn to the various branches of government. In Libya, the finance ministry collapsed, still not performing any of its functions. So you ended up with a central bank that is not only holding all the money, but it's also the one approving the spending. There's no spending has happened in the government without the approval of the central bank, which is quite, a flipped way of running central banks. The second thing is, of course, that with that kind of power comes slowly creeping, single-minded policies. And everybody in Libya and outside of Libya has been courting the central bank leadership, and all of the factions have been trying to sort of blackmail the central bank in multiple ways, some through simple friendships, some with even guns, some with political influence, and so on and so on. So this has got worse and worse as everything happens. Every time you allow first stages of this, like Libya itself, the first time you allow civil war to continue and allow. Usually, civil wars will only produce the worst kind of leadership if they're not stopped. And you continue that over 13 or 14 years, you end up with the situation we have here. The future is, I don't think, is going to be any different. I think Naji is going to find himself in a very difficult situation. I think he's going to be torn between all kinds of characters playing around. I think even the way the leadership of the central bank changed is problematic. I don't see it as positive. It basically allowed the presidential council to issue something that is not within its power. But the trick is, even though it actually triggered some kind of a chaos that the UN and others tried to sort of contain. Yes, they didn't get the governor they wanted, but they also showed that they can mess things up very quickly, and then everybody else has to come in and try to contain whatever decisions they make. I expect them to do more. I think they tasted that power, and I think they're going to be issuing a lot more of these kind of single-handed decisions.
Thank you so much, Hafid. I think I would like to put a pin in the power policy and how power is in Tripoli is being maneuvered around the central bank and all of that. Tim, would you tell us more about what led to this growing dispute between Kbir and the government of national unity?
In brief, it's a personal thing, like everything in Libya and the entire political structure of Libya, economic, the divisions, even military, militia, everything is just personal. There's really nothing behind it. There was a conflict between Sadiq Kbir and the Babies as a family, and then that spilled over as some of the advisors of NIFI in the presidential council saw an opportunity here to try to do something. They advised the president of the council to issue this order, and I'm aware exactly of the names of these people on both sides. And once that happened, it became a chaos. Everybody was going around trying to contain it because nobody gets paid if that continued. So they had a very strong motive. I don't see it as a great success of negotiation. I'm sorry. I think it's just everybody there knew that by the end of this month, they're not going to get paid unless they figure out something, because banks around the world stopped dealing
and he needed to be replaced. I'm sorry, Hafid, to interrupt you, but giving the floor.
Just the one addition to this is that the Federal Reserve of the United States is still, at least that's what I hear, is still holding out in terms of trying to get the new central bank governor to contract an independent accounting firm outside of Libya that can review the expenditures and the payments that the central bank is doing, especially because of the dollar nature of that. And that is the Federal Reserve's, basically authority. So it's still not ending in its relationships internationally. And, I don't know what's going to happen. But personally, I think you will see a much more corruption going on in using the central bank assets, especially the reserves that are outside of Libya. I think that's what some of these guys wanted access to, and that's where Sadiq Kbir was, a real serious obstacle in terms of letting them do that without a price.
Thank you.
Okay, Asma, thank you. Let me come into your question as well. I guess give my 2 cents on what led to the dispute. I'll start off though by welcoming you actually as an associate fellow. Delighted that you've joined our program as an associate fellow, and I think we've all followed your work for a long time and find the social lens that you apply to things fascinating. So I look forward to working more with you at Chatham House on these topics. And also to thank Hafid and Sais for this collaboration, of which we hope is a first step in a broader set of collaborative actions. And I guess Stephanie as well, for what was really, I think, your your leadership at UNSMIL really did have your finger on the pulse of seeing the problems that we encountered in Libya's economy as a real driver of the conflict, rather than just this kind of symptom of it. I guess when looking at the dispute, for me, I think you've got to look at this in the context of the flow of funds through the Libyan state more widely. Up until 2022, really, the central bank was the main distributor, had that role that Stephanie mentions, because the oil would be lifted by the NOC, sold internationally, funds would come in through the Libyan Foreign Bank, then sent to the Central Bank of Libya and subsequently distributed onwards. What happened in 2022, I think, is a critical moment in Libya's economic governance, with the replacement of the National Oil Corporation chairman, Mustafa Sanallah, with a deal for a new chairman, which was underwritten really through a deal between the Dbeibeh family in Tripoli and the Haftar family in the east. And this seemed to bring with it a sense of how money should be distributed via the NOC. And in fact, this broke effectively the monopoly of distribution of the central bank. So all of a sudden, a significant amount of spending, which had begun prior to the replacement of Sanallah, started to grow in terms of fuel swaps and activity in the oil sector, which meant that not all of the funds that were being collected in revenues were reaching the central bank. And I think it's worth noting that up until this point, the Central Bank of Libya had had quite a cordial relationship with the Dbeibeh-led government in Tripoli, and in fact had facilitated quite a large amount of spending. But I think from that point, you can see that a degree of distrust emerges, and the central bank starts to react to that, seeing the expenditure that's happening or not happening or unseen in the oil sector as an increasing problem, which therefore required addressing in reducing the amount of funds or limiting the amount of funds available to the authorities in Tripoli, which in turn led to a growing animosity between those two sets of players. And over time, you could really see that growing quite rapidly. And I think the result of this was that the central bank, which had kind of been this arbiter over who gets paid and when since 2014, was trying to maintain its hold on this decision-making power under the leadership of Sadiq al-Kabir, but was under increasing pressure. And that drew the central bank into the turf wars over being pro or anti-GNU, and the forces that were circling in Tripoli, providing kind of a backdrop to the events that we saw over this summer. And so you'll hear different explanations. The Presidency Council will explain that it believes that the central bank had been acting outside of its powers, and that was the reason for a change of leadership. But again, this reflected a broader malaise as well, in that in a situation of division, finding due process to make decisions and replace institutional leaders has been very difficult. The LPA, in seeking to protect the central bank for very good reason, also complicated some of those challenges. But I think what was also interesting about it was one of the reasons that this didn't play out as some of the protagonists expected is because ultimately the international players do have a role in deciding what happens here. When the decision was made by the PC and an interim governor was put in place, all of a sudden that governor found it hard to access international financial mechanisms. Pushbacks on key mechanisms such as SWIFT meant that actually it wasn't just down to the local actors to decide who they wanted to put in that position. So it wasn't just a question of who controlled the territory, but also who could put forward a kind of credible face of the central bank to an international community and a wider international system. So I think for me, this struggle is kind of the essence of conflict in a way in Libya, and also the kind of root of elite consolidation, because what we've seen in recent years is two increasingly powerful networks move up that flow of funds and the value chain to control finances directly. And in that sense, while Sadiq al-Kabir would be criticized and should be criticized for some of the ways that he monopolized power within the central bank, he had become a key blocker of those interests. And that's ultimately, I think, why the dispute arose and why he was pushed from office.
Thanks so much, Tim. It's so interesting to see how it grew, this distrust between the actors, and how the Presidential Council decided to side this time with the Government of National Unity. Thank you. Stephanie, so what lessons should the international community learn from these events with the CBL? How should external actors try to support accountability and transparency in engaging in the future with the bank?
Well, I think there's lots of lessons to be learned. Now, we did have a very interesting exercise that was commenced in the summer of 2018 as a result of one of the many oil blockades the country had experienced. And at that time, Mr. Haftar had refused to return the oil distribution to the internationally recognized National Oil Corporation. And so the then Prime Minister, Mr. Siraj, called for an audit of the two central banks in order to promote transparency and really sort of to try and address, the complaints and the concerns about how money was being distributed. It was a solo battle, to get that audit going was mostly a solo battle for about 2 years. There was enormous obstruction from the central bank in Tripoli, from the House or High State Council, from the Audit Bureau. It seemed at most times that the only person supporting it actually was Mr. Siraj. So we, after the United States in early July 2020, threatened sanctions, magically the audit got going. And it took about 6 to 7 months. It was during COVID. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the results got buried, though. And there was a mistake that was made by the then head of the UN mission to give the report to the Prime Minister of the UN recognized government, who, by the way, wasn't listed as one of the recipients. And basically he and the other institutions, including the bank, I think they basically just tried to put it in a drawer. Now, we need transparency for all of these institutions. And listening to what Tim just said about the National Oil Corporation, seems like maybe they also need something like, some kind of international audit, along with the Libyan Investment Authority. So here is where we get also to the overall role of the international community. Now, the economic track was mainstreamed into the Berlin architecture. It was on the same plane as the political track and the military security track. And that put the UN as the most impartial actor, international actor, in charge of that, leading that track. We worked closely. We had started working with Chatham House in 2018 in informal dialogues. Tim helped us transition to what became the Libyan Economic Experts Commission. Again, unfortunately, their work, their recommendations were also not welcomed after the new executive in Tripoli was created, because under this pretext of, sovereignty, so there are lessons to be learned. There is more that the international community can do under, I would argue, return to the architecture of Berlin, which hooks those working groups to the Libyan tracks. This is the time to rejuvenate the economic track. And you have your co-chairs, you have the United States, you have the European Union, and you have Egypt as co-chairs of that economic working group. They were critical, I would also remind people, in December of 2020. We had a meeting, we brought in the co-chairs of the various working groups within the Libyan Economic Experts Commission. We met in Geneva with the key Libyan sovereign institutions that led to the first board meeting of the central bank, I think in something like 6 years. That also helped us get some kind of budget process going for a united government. And it was because of that, just putting that pressure on internationally with the Libyan track. So I would argue for some kind of return to that architecture, that umbrella. And finally, and I became an apostle of this during my second stint in Libya as the special advisor. Look, you need to have some kind of resolution of the constitutional track, because at the heart of this conflict over resources and division of revenues is, what kind of state do you have? Is it a centralized state? Is it a decentralized state? Are you going to return to federalism? How are the revenues going to be distributed? Now, I think it's good that the chambers came together to forge this new CBL board and with the governor. I also met with them for some time in the spring of 2022 on the constitutional track. The one good thing that they did, and they were very frustrating for most of that, especially at the end, but I think that was also related to the knock deal that Tim talked about, the killing of those constitutional talks. They actually agreed a formula within a draft constitution for a return to the 13 provinces based on the electoral districts. So some kind of muscular decentralization, and they agreed the specific percentages, how the revenues would be dispersed on the national, provincial, and municipal level. I think somehow that's the kind of negotiation that needs to continue and to finish and to settle this, rather than skipping from one power sharing arrangement to another, one conflict over a sovereign institution to another.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. It's so important to always bring back how these processes, they're mediated, but also the fact that our status quo is still transitional, right? We are still in a transition, and so it's hinges a lot on these tracks, the constitution, etc. I will go to Hafid next, but I'd really love to ask you to be a bit more briefer, because we have a lot of Q&A. We have about 10 questions actually, and we'd like to respond to as many of them as possible. Hafid, what should the priorities of the new leadership for the CBL be? Is it possible for the central bank to return to its traditional role as defined by the law?
Everything is possible in this world, but it probably won't happen. This is a very fragmented country. It's a country that is basically, and I don't mean this in just be, I don't know, funny about it, but if you look at it as a whole, it's a country that is run by mafias. And I say mafias because they don't have any political programs. They don't have any political vision. The fight is on the oil, and power is what gets you to get the money. And you see all kinds of mafias playing in Libya. You have family mafias. You have tribal mafias, you have regional mafias, you have bureaucratic mafias within each ministry that are distributing and sort of stealing or getting all kinds of deals. So it is a structure that is really unique. I don't understand. I don't know how you can take one institution out of it and say this is going to be some kind of an example of transparency, good governance, and all of that, because all of these are fighting over that. So I don't expect any major changes. I think you'll see a lot of cosmetic changes just to please the international community, maybe do something with the issues that bother the Libyans themselves, which is the issue of liquidity, the issue of the price of the Libyan dinar. These are the most dominant things. And I think there will be some kind of offering on that front, but it's not going to be sustainable. I don't think it will be really real. And you can have all kinds of meetings. You can have all kinds of discussions between these bodies. These are facts on the ground. These bodies don't represent anybody. They have been the obstacle and got the country to this level because somehow the international community still insists to give them the credibility and legitimacy by engaging them as if they actually can do much. So I'm not very optimistic, to be honest. I don't see any pragmatic approach to solving Libya's problem except a federal system, as Stephanie mentioned. And it should be more than the 3 states that historically made Libya a long time ago. Demographics and social changes make it impossible to go back to that, despite that some hardliners want to do that, like Aguila Saleh. But I think as they agreed on the 13th, and I think there is a serious interest, a serious question that must be addressed, and that is the issue of federal system, not a decentralized system. A decentralized system is simply an administrative structure. A federal system is a sovereign issue. And therefore, you need to actually give each of these states some kind of a sovereignty over their laws, over their financial structures, over their ability to complement whatever comes from the central government. You need to weaken the central government and its ability to do anything. And that's going to somehow reduce the tension around all of these issues, because they're all trying to capture the government to spend the money.
Thanks so much, Hafid, for also centering the priorities for the Libyan people, not all the various actors, which I guess the challenge is more the various actors, but it's what Libyans really need.
Listening to the Libyan people, Asma, nobody. The only way you're going to listen to the Libyan people is if you have a map, like what Stephanie did, for example, in Geneva, and do a referendum, because they're not going to have elections. Then the parliament doesn't represent anybody except themselves in their pockets. But I think you could have produced a track in which you can ask the Libyans themselves in a referendum, which is much easier than doing elections. And therefore, you can actually pull the rug from under all of these actors presenting themselves as Libya's representatives.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Hafid. Tim, I'll move to you. How do you view this resolution to the crisis and at the CBL and the agreement for the new leadership? Do you think it signals a change for the role of the CBL and economic governance more widely?
To be honest, I'm a little bit unsure. I think that this could play out in a couple of different ways. I mean, on the positive side, I'm very supportive of the fact that the deal meant that there was a reconstitution of a board of directors of people of technical competence. The non-functioning of the board of directors had been a major governance flaw in the CBL for a long time. And frankly, the fact that former Governor Kabir was able to suggest that the central bank had been reunified without a board, I think was a very problematic position, because it effectively placed one, maybe two men as in sole control of a country's wealth, which is, I think, problematic. And in fact, if you look at the way the central bank is supposed to be run by law, the role of the board of directors is very important. So could this introduce a greater degree of due process? Could that also create a little bit more breathing space for a new governor to be less subject to direct intimidation and pressure from rival actors? Hopefully, I think this is where the optimism has to come from in these events. The challenge, on the other hand, is what Hafid mentions. How do you create an island of good governance in a situation which is increasingly fractious and lacks due process? So how can the central bank go back to doing what it's supposed to do, monetary policy, when there's still no formal arrangements around how budgets are formed and when expenditure is rising rapidly? And you mentioned the Libyan people here, Asma. I mean, maybe, we see this in in countries across the world, and certainly in an election that a few people have been watching, I understand that inflation is kind of an issue. And so how can the central bank actually manage those things if there's all of this unaccountable spending going on outside the parameters of formal rules? I think this is a really big challenge, which means that, and this is often the case, I don't think you can fix the CBL's books until you fix the NOC's books. And so I think Stephanie, in calling for transparency and clarity on what's happening in these areas, is spot on. And I think this is actually, certainly on the top of the US's list. And I think that this is, without some kind of resolution to that, I think that it will be impossible to see anything at the central bank improve. A couple of notes I'd also make is that the UN was clearly deeply involved in negotiations here, but there were multiple tracks. And certainly we know that there are behind closed doors agreements on these things and negotiations and expectations that come with those agreements. I personally now don't think it's possible for any institution in Libya to operate autonomously from its security umbrella. And that's particularly pertinent in Tripoli. We've seen a kind of changing of the guard of some institutions over who is providing security to them. And that's a pretty clear way of understanding who then has influence over those institutions. I think it can be quite easy to sit back from a Western perspective and say, well, they shouldn't be listening to this commander or this person, but there are facts of life for anybody who wants to remain in office and be able to operate an institution in Libya in 2024. And in that sense, I think just one final point, that not all of Libya's institutions are kind of equal. There are still an unknown number of institutions to me. Everybody quotes me a vastly different number. But if there are two that have to be managed and we have to have a very clear idea of what's going on, or Libyans have to have a very clear idea of what's going on, it's the NOC and the CBL. So I personally think that any momentum that's been picked up through this resolution to a CBL crisis and a change in leadership can only be followed through on with muscular diplomacy over what's happening with the oil sector, because actually there we're seeing a growing tendency towards privatization of wealth, which I think is quite a worrying emerging trait.
I just want to add, if I may, Asma, that, yes, Libya, the only reason Libya is still together or called one country is because of these two institutions that Tim just mentioned. It's the central bank and NOC, National Oil Company. Without these two, there is no country. That's the bottom line. And the question of who has the power, the physical power, is a very critical question. And unfortunately, Libyans are too afraid to do something about it. And the international community keeps on taking pictures with these guys as if they are the champions of peace and democracy.
Yeah, thank you. It is a big challenge for, I'll open up for the Q&A. We have quite a lot of Q&As, 15 questions. So I'll do a round and feel free, of course, to pick up on any question you'd like to answer. But also, I'd love to invite the panelists to also write to responses if you find a question that you see that is of interest to you to respond to, then we will do that in order to manage. But also, please make your interventions in a timely way so that we can get more questions. Okay, I'll read the first one from Nabil. With the recent increase in government salaries and expenditure, how will the Central Bank of Libya address challenges posed to foreign exchange reserves? What measure might the CBL leadership consider to balance with fiscal demands while safeguarding Libya's economic stability? Nabil also asked about the strategies of central bank administration to sustain monetary policy that supports Libya's economic stability and growth. And another question is from Nabil, who could you elaborate on the scope of central bank authority navigating these economic challenges, and particularly in light of its role in balancing fiscal responsibilities? I'll add two questions more from Mazir Buzakhar, will the new CBL board adjust the exchange rate again to support next year's government fiscal plan? And how can CBL improve fiscal transparency, and what specific measures should adopt to achieve this? I'll start with you, Stephanie, but feel free to respond to whichever you think is of an interest or not.
Okay, well, I think this is very much in Tim's wheelhouse, which is why we brought Chatham in on to help with the economic dialogue. But I would just return to the importance of encouraging as much transparency as possible. It was good that the bank started to, release those monthly reports. That's got to continue. Like same thing with the NOC, the same thing with God knows what's happening in the Libyan Investment Authority, right? I mean, at some point there were 3 people who were contesting, head of the authority and lawyers, and I think lawyers in London were making a lot of money, but I'm not sure anyone really knew what was going on inside the authority. So transparency is the best disinfectant.
Thanks so much. Hafez?
About the central bank reserves, here is the reality. A lot of people are exaggerating how much reserves Libya has. People are quoting 80 billion, 100 some billion. In 2012, it was about $132 billion when Gaddafi left. That's what was left. Today, the actual reserves that any central bank board or can actually use is $25 billion. The rest of it is, some of it is deposits that are belong to the investment authority that Stephanie just mentioned. Other amounts are a cover for the Libyan currency, so they cannot be touched. So the only one that they can use is that $25 billion. My expectation is, in order, they're going to continue to try to buy people's approval by spending more money, which will, of course, as they put more money into the market, prices are going to go up. So they're going to trigger inflation, which is still there, and they're going to increase it even more. I think spending is their way of trying to appease people, but I don't think that's a sustainable policy. And pretty much it's going to come to an end, and it's not going to be a pretty end.
Thanks. Yeah. Tim?
Yeah, I'm glad that The Economist just answered as well. So I very much focus on political economy, but I'm by no means masquerade as an economist. But I think a couple of key issues here. I mean, so one of the things which was deeply unpopular, of course, under Kabir was the reintroduction of a tax on access to foreign exchange. And this was also a key point of contention with the government. And again, I think we saw that the interim replacement for Kabir removed that tax. And my understanding is that still that hasn't been reintroduced. But so there are going to be problems that emerge from this because the fact that current expenditure can't keep pace. I think we're in a period where Nabil's question is going to become clearer because it's the subject of a lot of discussions mediated as well by the internationals, including one today. But I think the tensions are, in a country like the UK, for example, the central bank governor doesn't come under a lot of pressure for their decisions on inflation. But I think that is very different in the Libyan context. So were Naji Issa to reintroduce that tax, that's going to build public pressure. And indeed, there are a series of measures that the central bank are kind of expected to implement at the moment, which are supposed to build public confidence. But on that side, you can do those things. But if spending isn't going to be reined in, or responsibility isn't going to be taken on the other side, then how do you really manage that? And I think that creates the kind of short-term stability, but medium and long-term big-time problems, which has been growing for a while in Libya. So don't pretend to know all the answers to those questions, but clearly the component parts of a sensible economic policy require the executive to exercise restraint and caution and a balanced budget. And that although there are some commitments towards that, I would suggest that given the current dynamics and thirst for money from all various sources, there's an expectation among many of the actors that they're going to get what they get now, at least, if not more. So that's going to be very difficult to rein in. And I think, you know, that was something that the former central bank governor found out over the summer.
Thank you, Tim. I'll move to Amira's question, which is about how the change of allegiance between Sadiq al-Kabir and the East doing a U-turn over, and she wonders how is that because it's interest driven, or are there other consideration for these allegiances to swap so quickly after so many years? Omar is wondering if the central bank, how central is the central bank now with reports that Haftar is selling oil for his for the East through Eastern Port and using the central bank there to work through that. How soon, in your views, until oil is again weaponized between the two sides? And are we witnessing perhaps an end of the Beiba era soon? Walid Erteima wonders if, given the recent changes in the CBL and considering the state of the country, is it what realistic and significant steps can be taken to expand government spending effectively? And is it possible to create mechanism to ensure the implementation of unified budget despite division of executive authorities? And I'll take one more from Christopher. What have recent events revealed about any financial power the United States and Europe may have to influence decision-making among Libyan factions? How would you advise incoming US administration and Congress to use any such leverage? I'll start again with you, Stephanie, unless Hafid or Tim would like to jump in first.
I wonder if I could just jump in, because I've kind of got a bit of a take on the flip.
Okay,
if you like. And I think for those of us who've followed this closely, there's a kind of jaw-dropping element to seeing the HOR stick up for Sadiq after trying to remove him pretty much solidly for 7 years. Like, I'm sure it was on most every agenda that Stephanie had to engage with some of these players. So why? Because I think there was effectively an understanding that was reached. So another element of the shift in the oil sector was that the central bank sought to find agreement with Eastern-based authorities. And the details of this are pretty hazy. But if you look, one of the reasons the Presidency Council had it in for Sadiq al-Kabir is because the Presidency Council felt that its High Financial Committee was sunk by the central bank governor. And the end of that High Financial Committee led to a deal between East and West to reunify the central bank without a board. At that point, the Eastern stipulation that Sadiq had to be removed was lifted. So we ended up in this very complicated situation where explaining Libya or understanding Libya was always very difficult, but people would make the case for East and Western blocks, but all of a sudden you had alliances that were very weak or understandings that crisscrossed East and West. And so that's why, because there was an understanding between East and West over money being sent to the East, which you could take a view on whether it's right or wrong, that also played a role in determining why the HOR actually opposed the removal of Sadiq al-Kabir, and actually why we saw an oil or partial oil blockade for the first time in a couple of years. There's no coincidence that the oil blockade came because it disrupted, an understanding or series of understandings. When those understandings were in place and more money was distributed, we didn't see oil blockades. So there are a lot of clues that you can take away from those developments.
Would you like to go next, Stephanie, or Hafid?
I'll go quickly because I'm not going to, Tim has said a lot of what I was going to say. So look, I think it was Deborah Jones, the former U.S. ambassador, who said that, the Libyan ruling class, the Libyan elite are nothing if not transactional, flexible, and ethically challenged or something along those lines. So yes, I mean, all of the different, switching of allegiance, it just makes your head spin. I mean, every time if I occasionally go on social media and see what's happening in Libya, I'm just, totally amazed. But this gets to, yes, this is not an East-West division, or this isn't an ideological, I mean, everyone who sees events in Libya through the prism of political Islam, no. This is a struggle, this is a conflict over access to power and resources. And therefore, it is a much more complicated peace process, in that you must mainstream these drivers into the overall resolution. And for these powerful member states, these powerful countries who, I mean, has referred to sometimes the horrifying pictures of, that you see of, meeting with some of these terrible actors. As long as these international powers prioritize things like counterterrorism, counter-migration, that's their policy priority, they are bound to be meeting with actors who have no interest in state building, no interest in institution building. These are the people who are invested in the status quo, invested in the chaos, because that allows them to predate. So, we have to get beyond this into, again, back to this more comprehensive peace process. Finally, sanctions work in Libya. Use the sanctions tool. Corrupt Libyan elite, dinosaurs, kleptocrats, whatever you want to call them, put their money into nice banks in the city where you and Tim, work, and elsewhere in Europe. They like to visit their money, sanction them.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, without sticks, nothing is going to happen in Libya, and they got away with it. Yes, the international community needs to engage with some of these horrible actors, but they don't have to take it public, because the message they send to the Libyan people is that we're supporting this guy by taking a public picture with nice smiles and all of that. And Libyans don't know what these messages are happening. I mean, for example, a U.S. Special Envoy can deliver as tough of a message as he wants. But once he is in public taking pictures and smiling with some of these characters, there is no blame on the Libyans of seeing it, understanding it, interpreting it as a support by the United States government for this character. That's been happening for years. And that's what created this class of real, basically, if you strip away their military, their ties and suits and so on, they're basic thugs, nothing more than that. They as Stephanie said, there is nothing ideological about them. They have no interest in the state. They have nothing except trying to capture as much resources as they can. Unfortunately, Stephanie, I know that it will be lovely if they're depositing it like before in Geneva and London, because you can count on that, being frozen. Now they are being hosted by Abu Dhabi, as every dictator from around the world. Everybody in Asia, in Africa, and so on, they're all depositing their money in Abu Dhabi banks, because over there they are immune. And they're going to go around the sanctions. So they're all visiting Abu Dhabi these days instead of Geneva and London. But we come back to the same bottom line, is all of this talk about trying to do the right thing, getting them to agree on this, it's not going to work, because the infrastructure is not there to make it happen. Whatever the intentions, at the end of the day, you can be honest about trying to get Libya to an election, to transparency, to good governance, to all of this stuff. The problem is this, and I love what Deborah said. I would have said it much harsher than just ethically challenged, you're not going to get anywhere. Honestly, I believe Libya's future is going to be dominated by the most brutal military force. The most ruthless you are, the most you're going to be able to control it. And or the other thing is a complete fragmentation of the country, to little states like, Italy back in history, or Switzerland, until you have some leadership that can provide some logic and some support from the international community. But as long as the countries in the Security Council, as long as European representative or Americans or whatever are still pretending that what the guys they're dealing with are political figures and they represent the Libyan people, we're not going to get anywhere. It's a very sad, complex. I would love to be talking about the future and what they can agree on and how we're going to get to elections, but nothing's going to happen. About the switching of loyalties, it's very pragmatic. Everything switches in Libya. Today they are allies, tomorrow they're not. Yesterday, the Mufti, who was supporting Dbeiba against Sadiq, issued a condemnation of Dbeiba now about his irresponsible spending. Khalid al-Mishri and Aguila, and I think one of the triggers was of the central bank thing is that Khalid al-Mishri and Aguila are now best buddies and they're trying to form a government together. Trying to actually get these different strands together, it's a spaghetti, right? It keeps on changing. So you can't really separate it. And I think we need to be brutally honest and straightforward about the real characters we're dealing with, because without that, Libya, as you know, Asma, as you know, Ethan, is very personality driven, and trying to keep up with the moods of Haftar or Dbeiba this morning and what he wants to do is just a waste of time. My line, and I'll conclude with this, please. And Stephanie heard me say this. I said it to U.S. officials. The international community needs to put very specific demands, right? And needs to have these guys cross over to accept these demands. Otherwise, they don't deal with it. So you put red lines and you say, look, we expect you to do this and this and this and accept no violence, no this, whatever. That's when we're going to deal with you and take pictures with you. But we're not going to be running around trying to please you. I mean, the craziness is that a lot of people think, especially in the US, I don't know about Europe, they go to meet, for example, with Haftar or any of the, because they think this is what's going to convince him to shut the door in front of the Russian. He's not going to do that. All he's going to learn, him and Aguila, is that we can blackmail the United States. So every time he wants something, he'll take a picture with a general from the Russian army. You can't run after these people. The international community needs to have very clear lines of what it expects these characters to do, and if they are not willing to do it, then they don't deal with it or put sanctions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hafid, on that end note.
Thank you.
All of these actors, and I'm very sorry that we couldn't answer all the questions. I'm very grateful for your engagement. There's now 20 there keep more questions coming up, but I hope indirectly the panel has been able to respond to some of these. I would very much love to thank and all of you thank the panelists for their interventions and responses and your time, and I'd like to thank the audience for their time and for also their incredible engagement. Thank you, Hafid, Stephanie, and Tim. It was really a stimulating discussion, and could have sat and listened to you speak for hours. But I'm very grateful to everyone. Thank you.
Shukran.